Ah, listen to the silence of the night. The sound of those crackling logs were once the echoes of great empires. Now it beckons us on a journey that will take us into the chaos, intrigues, and dreams of centuries ago. Today I will tell you the story of Charlemagne, a man who left an enormous mark on history. But this is not just his story. It is the story of an era, the story of a king, a conqueror, and a legacy left behind by perhaps Europe's first true leader. Imagine, once upon a time, Europe was in the grip of chaos, wars, and division. In the dark labyrinth of the Middle Ages, people needed the light of a leader. That light was found in Charlemagne, king of the Franks. His name resonated not only as a ruler, but as a reformer, a cultural revolutionary, and, perhaps most importantly, a visionary who showed that dreams can come true. But who was Charlemagne? How did he unite such vast territories and redraw the map of Europe? What did he see in his life? What challenges did he overcome? And what triumphs did he achieve? These are events that shed light not only on the dusty pages of the past, but even on today's world. And here, dear listeners, I want you to listen to the warmth of the fire, the magic of words, and the song of history, to learn the answers to these questions. This story will begin with the rise of a dynasty. The House of Carolingian was a family at the heart of Europe. But this was no ordinary noble family. As they stepped onto the stage of history, they would change the course of an era. But how did this happen? Who laid the first stones? And how deep were the roots of this dynasty? Right here, with these questions, I invite you to our next story, the rise of the Carolingian dynasty. With the crackle of fire, we will discover together the secret of this fascinating beginning. Dear listeners, I'm going to take you to the brink of a dark era. One dynasty's power is fading, while another's star is slowly rising. The Merovingians. This dynasty was once a glorious lineage that ruled the Frankish kingdom. But the dust of time erodes even the most powerful empires. The Merovingians did not escape it. The glory once ushered in by Clovis had faded in the shadow of weak and ineffective kings, popularly known as the lazy kings. These leaders were unable to carry the throne beyond a symbol. Their authority to rule had diminished to the point of non-existence, and they had lost all respect in the eyes of the people. So, my friends, what happens in such a vacuum? History does not like vacuums. Power is concentrated in a new hand. It was precisely in this period that the Carolingian family was rising step by step on the stage of history. Who were these Carolingians? They were a family that had been serving as mayordomus, or courtiers, to the Merovingian kings for years. But they were not just ordinary servants. For years, they had borne the burden of running the kingdom, commanded the army, and communicated with the people. People now knew who the real leader was. They trusted the Carolingian family to pull the strings, rather than the kings who sat on the throne. One of the most important names that reinforced the power of the Carolingian family was undoubtedly Pepin. Pepin, a leader known for his bravery on the battlefield and his political acumen to outwit his enemies. But his power did not only come from his sword, he also mastered the art of diplomacy. He knew the pulse of the people, understood the power of the church, and had a vision that brought these two elements together. Pepin realized that the Merovingian throne had become a shadow play. In the eyes of the people, a king had to be a king by power and charisma, not just by title. But it took courage to proclaim this truth. And Pepin was a brave man. When he decided to depose the Merovingian king, he did not act like an ordinary rebel. Instead, he stepped onto the stage of history and asked the great question: is a king in name only, or in power? The echo of this question was heard even in Rome. Pepin sent an envoy to the Pope and decided to leave the answer to this question to the highest authority of the Church. For he knew that a dynastic change without the support of the Church would not be accepted by the people. The Church's endorsement of a king's legitimacy as God's representative on earth meant everything in this period. Did the Pope realize that in answering this question he was changing not just one family, but the history of Europe? Perhaps yes. He granted Pepin's request and crowned him with a sacred ceremony. It was not only the rise of a leader, but also a new configuration of the balance of power between church and state. It was the moment when the Carolingian family proclaimed its kingship, and it was a turning point that shaped the future of Europe. Imagine, my friends, that Pepin's move was not just a change of throne. It was the beginning of a new era. Europe was no longer just a political battleground, but a continent where sacred unity was the goal. Pepin was not just a king, but the founder of a new order. But friends, this story of Pepin does not end here, because the steps he took laid the foundation for a legacy that would change the fate of not only the Carolingian family, but the whole of Europe. But who will inherit this legacy? How will the dream of European unification be realized? In the next episode, we will talk about the emergence of Charlemagne, one of the greatest leaders in history. Get ready, because this story is just beginning. Dear friends, we continue our story that takes us back to one of the most brilliant and turbulent periods in European history. On the stage shaped by the rise of the Carolingian family, we now hear the footsteps of a leader preparing to make history. Yes, Charlemagne, but his path to the throne is not so easily paved. On the contrary, it is woven with betrayals, intrigue, and inevitable fate. The year 768, Pepin's death was a great loss for the Carolingian family, but it also marked the beginning of a new era. Pepin left the kingdom to his two sons, Charlemagne and Carloman. At the time, it was not unusual in Europe for the throne to be shared between two heirs, but while such joint reigns often began with a promise of peace, they were often the scene of bitter conflict. And so it was. Charlemagne was a strong, courageous, and charismatic leader, determined to protect his father's legacy. But Carloman, well, he was different. He was a more cautious leader than his brother, sometimes more temperamental and lacking in self-confidence. The rule of these two brothers was fraught with conflict from the very first days. The kingdom's territory was divided in two, with Charlemagne's banner on one side and Carlomagne's on the other. But the borders were not just lines drawn on maps. They also represented the cold walls between the two brothers. Carloman constantly questioned Charlemagne's decisions and tried to trump his authority. Charlemagne, on the other hand, had a broader vision. He dreamed of uniting not only the Frankish kingdom, but the whole of Europe. But to realize this dream, he first had to reconcile with his brother. Unfortunately, the language of diplomacy was not enough here, because Carloman looked at Charlemagne as a rival and hated to be in his shadow. But fate intervened in this story. Carloman died unexpectedly at a young age. While some historians see this death as a natural process, others interpret it as part of a deeper conspiracy. But whatever the truth, Carloman's death removed Charlemagne's greatest obstacle. He was now the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom. After Carloman's death, Charlemagne quickly took control. His brother's widow and children tried to claim the throne, but they were no match for Charlemagne's power. The people and the nobles submitted to Charlemagne's leadership because he was seen not only as a king, but also as a source of hope and a unifying force. But, dear friends, being a ruler is not just about wearing a crown. Charlemagne had an entire Europe in front of him, a continent divided by different cultures, religions, and traditions. His vision was to unite these lands under one roof. In pursuing this dream, Charlemagne would become not just a king, but an emperor. But how? Which enemies would he face? Which victories would etch his name in the history books? In the next episode, we will explore Charlemagne's conquests that shaped Europe and how he cemented his place in European history. Are you ready? Now take a deep breath, because our story is about to get even more exciting. My listeners, with Charlemagne crowned king and taking the reins of his rule, the fate of Europe was once again at a crossroads. But the bigger a king's dreams, the more formidable the challenges he faced. Charlemagne did not just want to expand his territory. His vision was not only to create an empire, but to unite this empire around a single faith, a single order. But there was an obstacle to this dream. The Saxons, the stubborn and warlike people of the north. The Saxons, known for their unique traditions, their passion for freedom, and their stubborn spirit, this people stood like a thorn in the side of the Frankish kingdom. Their devotion to pagan gods, their resistance to Christianity, and their refusal to submit to the Franks made them a target for Charlemagne. Charlemagne wanted not only to conquer these people, but to Christianize them and make them part of his new order. But this was not a matter of words. Blood had to be shed, battles had to be won, and faith had to be fought for. The Saxon Wars would be one of Charlemagne's longest and most exhausting struggles. These wars lasted for almost 30 years. Yes, 30 years. Imagine. A generation-long struggle, not only for territory, but also for souls. Charlemagne sent Frankish armies into Saxon territory time and time again. With each victory, the Saxon leaders were forced into submission, but with each defeat, the stubborn people rose again. The first campaigns targeted the Saxon sanctuaries. In particular, Charlemagne sought to demoralize the Saxons by destroying the sacred pillar called Irminsul, the center of their faith. The destruction of Irminsul was a great loss for the Saxons. But even this could not completely destroy their fighting spirit. With each defeat, they managed to recover and continue their resistance against the Franks. Charlemagne waged war not only with the sword, but also with the power of religion. Churches were built in place of pagan temples, Christian missionaries were sent to Saxon lands, and the local population was forced to convert to Christianity. At that time, those who refused to convert to Christianity were even sentenced to death. Charlemagne's policy has left historians wondering whether he was a hero for Christianity or a tyrant. But one thing was certain: Charlemagne believed that the way to unite Europe was to unite around a single belief system. One of the most important moments of these wars was the resistance of Widukind, a Saxon leader. Widukind was a charismatic leader who became a symbol of Saxon independence. He repeatedly challenged Charlemagne, organized the Saxon resistance, and fought for the freedom of his people. But after years of fighting, Widukind finally surrendered and converted to Christianity. His baptism symbolized the end of the Saxon resistance. But this surrender did not mean the submission of his people. For many years, the Saxons secretly tried to keep their faith alive. After long and bloody battles, the Saxons were officially incorporated into the Frankish Empire and Christianized. But this process was not just a change of religion, it was also a transformation of culture. Charlemagne's victory is considered one of the most concrete steps in his vision of unifying Europe. But it is also one of the most controversial examples of government oppression in the name of Christianity. So, dear friends, did Charlemagne rule only by the power of the sword and religion? Or did he have other qualities that made him unique throughout history? In our next installment, we will look at Charlemagne's reforms in education and culture, and how he led Europe into an era of enlightenment. If you are ready, our story continues with all the excitement. My listeners, I will now take you to another turning point in history, to the lush valleys of Italy and the ancient Lombard lands in the shadow of the Alps, where Charlemagne, the mighty king of the Franks, would once again test his power and will. But this time, it was not just about the subjugation of a people or the conquest of territory. This was a struggle that would shape the fate of the Christian world. It all started with the Lombards' threatening behavior towards the Pope. Desiderius, the Lombard king, coveted Rome and the papal lands and began to squeeze the spiritual leader of Christendom. The Pope was looking for an ally to help him out of his predicament. And who could be more suitable? Charlemagne was seen as the protector of Christianity, God's sword on earth. Through letters and envoys, the Pope begged Charlemagne for help. This was not only an immature peace, but also an opportunity. Charlemagne saw this help as a strategy that would help not only the Pope, but also the strength of his own kingdom. Charlemagne gathered his army and marched through the difficult passes of the Alps towards Italy. It was not an easy journey. The bitter cold of winter, the steep mountain roads, and the Lombard obstructions slowed the Frankish army. But Charlemagne's will was unbreakable. At every step of the way, he kept his army in good spirits and overcame the difficulties with his own determination. When the Frankish army finally reached Lombard territory, Desiderius was waiting for them. But the Lombard king was overwhelmed by Charlemagne's power and strategy. Charlemagne quickly defeated Desiderius's army and laid siege to the city of Pavia. Pavia! In those days, this city, the heart of the Lombard kingdom, was known for its strong walls and strategic location. Charlemagne was determined to capture the city after a months-long siege. The Frankish army was at the city's gates. Starvation and fear from the inside and Charlemagne's army from the outside were squeezing the Lombards. Finally, Desiderius was forced to give up. Charlemagne seized the Lombard throne and proclaimed himself King of the Lombards. This was a unique event in that a king of the Franks was crowned ruler of another people. But one of the most important aspects of this victory was the strengthening of the relationship between Charlemagne and the Pope. The Pope looked to Charlemagne not only as an ally, but also as God's chosen protector. Charlemagne's seizure of the Lombard throne contributed greatly to the unity of the Christian world and secured the authority of the Pope. It was not only the triumph of a king, but also symbolized an era in which religion and politics were intertwined. On the day Desiderius surrendered at Pavia, a new era began for Charlemagne's Christian Europe. But, dear listeners, what was the price of these victories? Did Charlemagne only gain territory with this victory, or did it also increase his responsibilities? And how did this victory shape his relationship with the Pope? What gift would Charlemagne's rise in the eyes of the Pope offer him in the future? In the next episode, we will witness Charlemagne's rise as the leader of the Christian world and the steps he took to reunite Europe. Are you ready? Then let this great story continue in all its glory. Dear friends, I now take you back in time to the sun-baked lands of the Iberian Peninsula. There, on the frontier between Charlemagne, the glorious king of the north, and the rich Islamic civilization of the south, a struggle took place that echoes throughout history. It was not just a battle for territory, it was a clash of faiths, cultures, and forces. After conquering the Lombard kingdom and strengthening his ties with the Pope, Charlemagne turned his eyes south to Muslim lands. In those years, the Muslims controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula, and the Andalusian Umayyads ruled the region, which was extremely powerful both politically and culturally. But as with any great power, there were cracks within it. There was friction among local rulers, some of whom desired the support of a leader like Charlemagne. In this chaos, the Duke of Barcelona and some local Muslim leaders asked Charlemagne for help. Charlemagne saw this invitation as an opportunity. An expedition into Muslim lands would not only demonstrate the power of Christianity, but would also secure the southern borders of the Frankish kingdom. So a great army was assembled, armor was donned, and the banners of Charlemagne marched towards the Iberian lands. The campaign was hard, dear listeners. The Frankish army struggled through the steep passes of the Pyrenees Mountains, facing the challenges of both nature and the enemy. The Muslims put up a strong resistance against the Franks, but Charlemagne's strategy and determination led his army to victory. Significant successes were achieved around Barcelona, and buffer zones were established along the Ebro Valley. These buffer zones were not only a border between Muslims and Christians, but also the Frankish kingdom's southern line of defense. But every victory comes at a price, dear friends. As Charlemagne's army retreated, an unforgettable tragedy occurred in the Pyrenees Mountains, at the Roncesvalles Pass. The Basque people, collaborating with the Muslims, ambushed the rear guard of the Frankish army, causing a major defeat. This event not only cast a shadow over Charlemagne's campaign, but also inspired legends such as the famous Saga of Roland. Nevertheless, this campaign was a strategic victory for Charlemagne. The buffer zones he created on the Iberian Peninsula made the Franks' power felt to the south, deepening the turmoil in Muslim lands. Charlemagne was not only a warrior, but also a statesman. He used these buffer zones to ensure the safety of Christians and expand the borders of the Frankish kingdom. But let us pause here, my friends. Were these buffer zones really going to ensure a lasting peace? Or were they going to sow the seeds of the struggle between the Franks and the Andalusian Umayyads? How would Charlemagne's initiative change the balance in the south of Europe in the future? And more than that, how did that unforgettable ambush in the Pyrenees leave its mark on Charlemagne's mind? In the next installment, we will see this great ruler's adventure as he turns his eyes north again and makes his way to the heart of Europe. But this is the beginning of another story. Are you ready? Then let our story continue with all its excitement. My dear friends, now I take you to the heart of the Frankish Empire, to Aachen, the apple of Charlemagne's eye. This city was built not only as a center of government, but also as a temple of culture and wisdom. When he secured the borders of his growing empire and returned from victorious campaigns, Charlemagne had a new vision in mind, to transform not only the land, but also the people. And at the heart of this great transformation would be Aachen. Aachen was an ordinary settlement by the standards of the time, but with Charlemagne's touch it was transformed into a miracle. He had a great palace complex built there, a symbol not only for a ruler, but also for an empire. The splendor of the palace represented architectural splendor and unity. The most remarkable building was undoubtedly the Palatina Chapel, built on Charlemagne's orders. This chapel was not only a religious space, but also a symbol that embodied the spirit of divine authority and empire. Its architecture, with Roman and Byzantine influences, was a reflection of Charlemagne's desire to unite all of Europe. But Aachen was built not only with stones, but also with ideas. Charlemagne was not content with making the city a military and political center. He wanted to turn it into a center of knowledge and culture. At the time, education was a neglected area in much of Europe, but Charlemagne believed that knowledge and learning were the true foundations of an empire. He established monastic schools where both clergy and lay people were educated. He himself was passionate about learning. It is said that he stayed up late into the night reading and writing. Yes, my dear friends, Charlemagne did not learn to write, but this did not diminish his passion for science and education. During what we call the Carolingian Renaissance, ancient Roman and Greek artifacts were rediscovered and preserved. Charlemagne invited the greatest scholars of the time to his court, including the famous Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin. Alcuin guided Charlemagne's reforms and initiated the standardization of the Latin script. Many of the letters we use today are the result of these efforts. Manuscripts were decorated and reproduced, saving Europe's ancient knowledge from being lost. This great transformation was not limited to education. Charlemagne also attached great importance to religious reforms. He established rules to ensure unity and discipline among the churches. During his reign, Christianity ceased to be merely a belief system and became one of the main pillars of imperial rule. Aachen became the center of these reforms. Here, decisions were made, laws were written, and the foundations of a civilization were laid that shaped the future of the empire. But my friends, this story does not end here. The reforms and changes in Aachen were just the beginning of Charlemagne's influence on Europe. But don't you wonder what kind of legacy this great ruler would leave to his throne after building such a glorious empire? Did Charlemagne plan how the order he built would continue after his death? Or was this glorious empire in danger of crumbling at the hands of his successors? The answers to all these questions and more await us. Are you ready? Our story will continue in all its splendor. My dear friends, I will now tell you about perhaps one of Charlemagne's greatest and most enduring legacies, the spread of Christianity and his collaboration with the Church, which shaped the soul of his empire. Charlemagne was not only a warrior and a ruler, he was also a visionary. In his eyes, an empire was strengthened not only by the sword, but also by faith. And the bearer of that faith was the Church, the most powerful spiritual and intellectual institution of the time. Charlemagne's approach to the Church was not just a spiritual attachment. It was an integral part of his approach to governance. He aimed to make the Church a pillar of the empire. But this was not an easy task, because the Church at that time was plagued by internal divisions and lack of discipline. Charlemagne set out to solve these problems and reorganized the Church hierarchy. He meticulously defined the duties of bishops and priests and made the functioning of the Church more organized and disciplined. He ensured that all religious authorities within the borders of the empire worked in harmony with each other. In Charlemagne's eyes, the Church was not only a place of worship, but also a building block where the people were educated, social order was maintained, and the spirit of the empire was nurtured. These arrangements did not remain only on paper. Charlemagne generously donated land to support and strengthen the power of the Church. These land grants both increased the economic power of the Church and strengthened its influence over the people. Using this land, the Church increased its own revenues and had a wider scope of action to meet the needs of society. But Charlemagne's support was not just an act of generosity. It was part of his strategy to unite the people and create a common identity within the empire. Moreover, Charlemagne saw Christianity not only as a belief system but also as a tool of governance. On his behalf, the Church educated the people, maintained order through preaching, and carried Charlemagne's authority to the remotest corners of the empire's borders. Churches and monasteries became not only places of worship but also centers of knowledge. In monasteries, ancient texts were preserved, new ideas were generated, and this knowledge was disseminated among the people. By increasing the number of these centers, Charlemagne also encouraged a cultural revival. However, this cooperation was not limited to Charlemagne's support for the Church. The Church also showed its gratitude to Charlemagne. The Pope legitimized his reign, which strengthened the perception that Charlemagne had not only earthly, but also divine authority. In fact, Pope Leo III's coronation of Charlemagne in 800, in its proclamation of Charlemagne as Emperor of Rome, was the culmination of this cooperation. This bond between the Church and the Empire became one of the strongest alliances that shaped the next centuries of Europe. But my dear friends, Charlemagne's collaboration with the Church was not just a strategy of governance. In his eyes, Christianity was a spiritual guide that had to be at the heart of the empire. And what were the effects of this grand alliance on the fate of Europe? Did this bond between Church and Empire make Europe stronger? Or did it sow the seeds of future divisions and conflicts? And how did the crowning of Charlemagne by the Pope as the new Roman emperor transform the political and religious balance in Europe? We will continue to seek answers to these questions, dear friends, because our story is not yet complete. If you are ready, in the next step, we will discover how Charlemagne received the imperial crown and how this event left its mark on European history. Now close your eyes and imagine, dear listeners, two great powers, the Carolingian Empire and Byzantium, face off in the vast lands to the east of Europe. The history of these two giants has been written not only by the clash of swords, but also by clever diplomatic moves. Did Charlemagne and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VI realize that in testing each other's strength, they were actually shaping the future of Europe? This story begins with border conflicts. Byzantium had long wanted to consolidate its hold on the Balkans, but the Carolingians were rapidly gaining power in the region. Sandwiched between Slavic tribes, Hungarians and Avars, this land was a strategic gold mine. The fate of Central Europe depended on the decisions to be taken here. Charlemagne could not remain silent against the diplomatic intrigues of Byzantium, because every victory had cleared the way for the restoration of Byzantium and Herons. This land was a strategic gold mine. The fate of Lycurgians had long minded to enlighten. Along Byzantium's borders, the invasions of the Avars were a real nuisance. With their marauding armies, the Avars threatened both Byzantium and Carolingian lands. Charlemagne set out to put an end to the threatening presence of this barbarian people. His expeditions to the lands controlled by the Avars were not only a military victory, but also a diplomatic message. With these victories, Charlemagne was sending a clear message to Byzantium and the rest of Europe. I am here, and these lands are under my control. These campaigns completely destroyed the military power of the Avars, so much so that the Avar people never again appeared on the stage of history. But this was not just the war, it was also a show of authority. After these victories, Charlemagne sent settlers to the Avar lands and integrated them into the Carolingian Empire. He also accelerated his efforts to spread Christianity in these new lands. Churches were built, monasteries established, missionaries sent eastward. Charlemagne was not only a soldier, but also a cultural revolutionary. On the diplomatic front, things were more complicated. Byzantium and the Carolingians were exchanging letters, sending envoys and negotiating alliances. Byzantium was deeply disturbed by the proclamation of Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor in 800. Byzantium, which claimed to be the legitimate heir of Rome, did not welcome this new empire. However, Charlemagne, with his diplomatic acumen, managed to manage this tension without turning into a conflict. The relations between the two empires were neither based on friendship nor enmity. It was a constant balancing act between the two great powers of Europe. But, dear listeners, the story does not end here. While the echoes of Charlemagne's victories against the Avars and his fragile relationship with Byzantium was still reverberating in Europe, a completely different scene was being prepared in Rome. Pope Leo III was on the verge of taking a decision that would change the course of history. So what happened in Rome in 800 had changed the fate of Europe. Stay by the fire a little longer for the answers to these questions, dear friends, because my story is not over yet. Ah, dear friends, are you ready to delve into the dusty pages of that fascinating year that changed the course of history? There was a moment that bridged the ancient splendor of Rome with the chaotic politics of the Middle Ages, a moment that shaped the destiny of Europe. I take you back to that cold winter morning in the year 800. Can you hear the footsteps echoing through the stone streets of Rome? A ceremony initiated by Pope Leo III would forever change the life of Charlemagne, who dreamed of becoming emperor. Imagine an entire empire that was once the center of the world, Rome. Over time, however, the mighty structures fell, and the footsteps of barbarians replaced the legionary boots that once echoed through its streets. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe had never found its old order. It was at this point that the name of Charlemagne, the mighty king of the Franks, rose. He was not only a warrior, he was also a visionary. Charlemagne not only conquered lands, but also dreamed of uniting Europeans around a common culture and religion. But this dream came true on that memorable day with a ceremony in Rome. Rome, December 1800. Despite the cold weather, the crowd gathered in St. Peter's Basilica shivered with warm excitement. Pope Leo III summoned Charlemagne to his presence. Accompanied by the sacred hymns that filled the basilica, the Pope placed the famous crown on Charlemagne's head and gave him the title Emperor of Rome and Augustus. This moment symbolized not only the accession of a king as emperor, but also the rebirth of the glory of ancient Rome. In that moment, the legacy of the Roman Empire was carried into the heart of Western Europe. But, my friends, this was no ordinary coronation. This was a symbolic moment that shaped the future of Europe. Charlemagne was not only proclaimed the successor to the Roman Empire, he was also recognized as the leader of the West. This move by Pope Leo III was not only a religious gesture, but also a profound play of politics. The Pope thus won the support of the most powerful leader in the West, and at the same time sent a clear message to Byzantium: you are no longer alone in the West, for the spirit of Rome still lives. So what did this crown mean for Charlemagne? On the surface, it was a badge of honor, but deeper down, the weight of this crown was measured by the responsibilities it carried. Charlemagne was no longer just a king, but the protector of Christendom, the unifier of Europe, and the heir to Rome. He had not only expanded the borders of the empire, he had united Europe around a common ideal. This ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica symbolized the beginning of a new era in Western Europe. The splendor of ancient Rome was blended with the Christian faith, and the Carolingian dynasty took on a new identity. However, this fusion was not easy, for the idea of this new empire depended not only on Charlemagne's power, but also on the loyalty of the people and the support of the Pope. But have you ever wondered how this crown was received in Byzantium, far away from Rome? Was the proclamation of Charlemagne as emperor seen as an interference in the Byzantine emperor's right? Or was this new European order a different opportunity for Byzantium? Let us continue to delve deeper into this diplomatic conflict and the tensions between the two great powers. Because, dear friends, history never stops. My dear friends, as the echoes of Charlemagne's glorious coronation reached the four corners of Western Europe, everyone felt the power of this new empire. But history shows us that great powers always faced great tests. Charlemagne's accession to the imperial crown brought him not only triumphs, but also new challenges. Let's discover the story of the rebellions that broke out on the borders of that great empire and Charlemagne's struggles against them. When Charlemagne was crowned emperor and resurrected the legacy of Rome, his empire stretched from the Atlantic in the west to the Danube in the east. Ruling such vast territories was possible not only through military victories, but also through a strong central authority. However, the peoples living in the distant lands did not always welcome the new imperial order. Local communities, especially the freedom-loving Saxons, Basques, and Slavs, rebelled against Charlemagne's leadership. The first big problem came from the Saxon lands. The Saxons were a warlike people who clung to their ancient pagan beliefs. When Charlemagne's armies entered their lands and imposed Christianity, it became not only a matter of religion, but also a battle for identity. Widukind, a Saxon leader, united his people against Charlemagne. This guerrilla warfare waged deep in the forests and among the mountains became a major headache for the imperial armies. After each defeat, the Saxons regrouped and resisted. Although Charlemagne eventually succeeded in crushing the Saxon resistance, it was a victory won in blood and tears. But this was only the beginning. The Basques put up a similar resistance in the steep gorges of the Pyrenees Mountains. When Charlemagne's armies were ambushed at the Roncevaux Pass, the defeat dealt a major blow to the empire's myth of invincibility. The Basques took advantage of the mountains to challenge Charlemagne's powerful Frankish army. This made it clear that Charlemagne could not control all the lands based on military power alone. In Eastern Europe, Slavic tribes began their own struggle for freedom against Frankish authority. Local leaders along the Danube revolted against the governors sent by Charlemagne. For them, the empire was just a mechanism for exploitation. Charlemagne had to use diplomatic maneuvers to restore order in these lands. He tried to consolidate his authority in these regions, sometimes through harsh military measures. But, dear friends, these rebellions were not just external threats. As the empire expanded, internal cracks began to appear. Governors and lords, appointed by Charlemagne himself, sometimes put their own interests ahead of imperial law, leaving the people in an even more difficult situation. Charlemagne initiated a series of reforms to deal with this internal unrest. He sent royal agents to strengthen central authority, regulated taxes, and tried to regain public trust. But each solution brought a new challenge. One of Charlemagne's greatest challenges was to maintain loyalty and order in this vast geography. Every uprising, every conflict was a reminder of how fragile the empire was. But in overcoming these challenges, Charlemagne proved himself not only a warrior, but also a statesman. He tried to overcome these problems with both his sword and his mind. But now, dear friends, I would like to leave you with a question. Would Charlemagne, who managed to strengthen his empire while dealing with these rebellions, have been able to peacefully hand over his throne to the next generation? Or was the vastness of the empire a harbinger of a succession struggle? The answers to these questions will take us to another turning point in history. Wait, because our story is just beginning. Ah, my dear friends, what a great story we're in the middle of. Charlemagne was a leader who changed the course of history, not only with the power of his sword, but also with his sharp mind. He crushed rebellions, expanded his borders, and struggled to consolidate his empire. However, the expansion of the empire over such a vast geography was not a matter that could be managed solely through military achievements. It was precisely at this point that the foundations of an order deeply rooted in history began to be laid: the feudal system. After Charlemagne was crowned emperor, he sought ways to simplify the administration of his vast territories. It was not possible to fully implement the centralized administration of the Roman Empire, because the empire no longer consisted of only one city, but of remote and mountainous regions where different languages were spoken and different traditions were practiced. In order to maintain order in this vast geography, he needed to cooperate with local leaders. This need laid the foundations of the feudal system. Charlemagne was able to win the support of his army's loyal commanders and nobles by granting them large territories. But these lands were not just a reward. They were also a responsibility. Each noble had to protect his land and ensure the safety of the people who lived there. These people depended on their nobles for their daily lives. The nobles in turn swore loyalty to Charlemagne and pledged to send soldiers to the imperial army when necessary. The sharing of lands and responsibilities in such a chain system gave birth to the feudal structure, and this system was not only a military structure but also a social order. It was a world in which everyone belonged somewhere and everyone was responsible to a superior. In order to control the functioning of this order, Charlemagne constantly conducted inspections and sent royal agents all over the empire. They monitored the loyalty of these local lords to the emperor and checked that justice was being done. These efforts proved that Charlemagne was not only a conqueror, but also an order builder. But dear friends, these solid foundations of the feudal order were not just a military and political structure. It also required a balanced relationship with the Church, God's representative on earth. When Charlemagne took the imperial crown from the hands of Pope Leo III, it was not just a symbolic gesture. This alliance was a great gain for both church and state. The Pope strengthened his authority in the Christian world, while Charlemagne announced to the world that he had been crowned with a holy mission. However, this relationship was not always smooth. While the Pope wanted to increase his influence over the empire, Charlemagne used the support of the Church to consolidate his own authority. This was the first spark of a power struggle between church and state. The Church, while meeting the spiritual needs of the people, had also become a political power. Charlemagne managed to win the loyalty of the people by using the Church as a tool. He opened schools, supported monasteries, and made sure that Christianity spread to every corner of the empire. However, the influence of the Pope began to grow. This would sow the seeds of great tension between the empire and the Church in the years to come. Ah, my friends, the order Charlemagne established shaped the history of Europe, not only in his own time, but also in the centuries to come. The feudal structure completely changed the way of life of the people, the relationship between church and state, and the social order. But I cannot help but ask, did Charlemagne's system really create a lasting order? Or after the emperor's death, would chaos reappear in this vast territory? In the next episode, we will explore together the big decisions that shaped the future of the empire. Get ready, because history will take us into deeper waters. My dear friends, Charlemagne's empire, towering over the vast lands of Europe, could not survive on the sword and conquest alone. No empire could survive for long without a system where people could eat, trade could circulate, and security could be ensured. Charlemagne knew this fact very well. That is why he took his place on the stage of history, not only on the battlefields, but also with economic reforms. Here, the economy, the lifeblood of the empire, was gaining a new identity in his hands. Charlemagne's first goal was to revitalize trade and ensure the security of markets. Medieval Europe had long been plagued by instability, with bandits blocking the paths of merchants and markets crushed under the pressure of local warlords. Charlemagne embarked on sweeping reforms to end this chaos. His first order of business was to repair roads and bridges. Military garrisons were established along the roads so that merchants could travel safely. Tax stations along the trade routes were reorganized, creating a fair revenue system and preventing merchants from being crushed by heavy taxes. However, my dear friends, security was not enough for the revival of trade. The money used in the market also had to be stable and reliable. At this point, Charlemagne made history by introducing a new monetary system. The silver dinar began to be used as a standard denomination throughout the empire. Previously, coins of different weights and purity created great difficulties in trade. Charlemagne put an end to this confusion. By mandating the use of a uniform currency throughout the empire, he facilitated trade and increased economic stability. These reforms not only affected the lives of merchants, but also ordinary people. A standardized currency allowed peasants to trade more fairly when selling their produce. The silver dinar became not only a medium of exchange, but also a symbol of the empire's power and unity. Now a merchant in one corner of the empire could sell his goods for the same value in another corner. This not only strengthened the economy, but also increased the people's loyalty to Charlemagne. Charlemagne's economic reforms also encouraged agricultural production. Local festivals and market days were organized so that peasants could bring their surplus produce to the markets. This created social vitality and increased the volume of trade. In addition, the security of markets within the empire was constantly monitored. Royal agents made frequent checks to protect the rights of both merchants and buyers. My friends, it goes without saying that these economic reforms consolidated not only the people, but also the political power of Charlemagne. Local nobles within the empire were now not only the rulers of their territories, but also the guardians of the economic order. They were responsible for ensuring the safety of merchants and markets. This led to a strengthening of central authority and a closer allegiance of local leaders to Charlemagne. But these reforms also had an international dimension. Charlemagne used his economic system as an element of power that transcended the borders of his empire. The silver dinar began to play an important role in the commercial life of not only Europe, but also the Mediterranean world. Trade with the Muslim world, with the Byzantine Empire, and with Scandinavian merchants in the north began to use this new currency. Charlemagne's economic vision took his empire beyond being a European state and made it a world power. Now I cannot help leaving you with this question. Did Charlemagne's economic reforms really lead the empire to lasting prosperity? Or did this new order ignite the spark of great conflicts to come? Moreover, what were the effects of these major reforms on the social structure? In the next chapter, we will look for answers to these questions as we step into perhaps the most complex period of Charlemagne's life. My dear friends, the glory days of the Carolingian Empire were shaped not only by economic reforms and social adjustments, but also by ironclad defense strategies. A leader like Charlemagne knew very well that it was not only peace and prosperity that could sustain his empire. He understood that peace could only exist in the shadow of the sword, which is why he built an enormous defense network to protect his lands, surrounded by threats on all sides. Imagine those tall ships emerging from the dark fjords of the north. Fast, agile, and relentless, the Vikings used not only their courage, but also their incredible seafaring knowledge to attack the shores of Europe. These barbarian warriors were the scourge of the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne recognized early on the devastating effects of the Vikings' attacks and developed a series of strategies to counter them. In the northern regions, especially along the banks of rivers such as the Seine and the Loire, he built military fortifications and watchtowers. These towers were designed both as early warning of attacks and as shelter for small garrisons to stop the enemy. But Charlemagne did not stop at defense. He studied the Vikings' movements and tried to understand their weak points. It was at this point that he realized the need to create an army that could react quickly. Regular army units were supported by highly mobile cavalry, and small but effective naval fleets were formed to neutralize enemies on the river routes. Thus, whenever the Vikings tried to attack a village or town, Carolingian soldiers were instantly on their heels. This was how Charlemagne protected not only his territory, but also the morale of his people. My friends, if the dreaded Vikings of the north were not enough, threats from the east were also at the doorstep of the Carolingian Empire. Slavic tribes, Hungarians and Avars, were constantly raiding the borderlands. Charlemagne took a unique approach to establish a line of defense against these attacks. Marks, or border districts, were transformed into both military and administrative units. These marks were equipped with military garrisons under the command of local nobles who were constantly on guard. One of the most notable examples was the Mark of Bavaria, established on the eastern border. This was intended as a buffer zone against Slavic attacks. Charlemagne provided special incentives for the inhabitants of these areas to be both protected and to contribute to the defense. For example, peasants in these areas were offered lower taxes and were encouraged to support the border garrisons by farming. At the same time, nobles living on the eastern borders were authorized to recruit and train soldiers from the local population. My dear friends, Charlemagne's defense strategies were not limited to military measures. He also protected his borders through diplomacy, targeting the weaknesses of his enemies. Treaties with the Vikings and alliances with Slavic tribal leaders pacified the empire's northern and eastern borders. In particular, spoils or promises of land to the Viking leaders halted their attacks for a while. But Charlemagne knew that such diplomatic moves would only buy time, and he continued to reinforce his borders at all times. These defensive strategies not only protected the territory of the Carolingian Empire, but also demonstrated Charlemagne's leadership genius. He constantly worked to protect his people from the pains of war, realizing his dream of a secure empire. But these defensive efforts sometimes came at great cost. The burden of taxation on the people, the growing power of the nobility, and the constant needs of the army would cause major problems for the future of the Carolingian Empire. Now I cannot help asking you, my dear friends, did Charlemagne's massive defensive efforts only serve to protect the empire, or did these strategies eventually sow the seeds of new conflicts? And was the greatest threat to this powerful empire really coming from outside, or was an invisible enemy emerging from within? In the next episode, we will look for answers to these questions together. Stay tuned, because this story is not over yet. My dear friends, as in every moment of life, the stories of great leaders come to an end. But their legacy can be as enduring as time itself. The death of a leader like Charlemagne was not just the last gasp of a man, but the closing of an era that profoundly changed the destiny of a vast empire. Let's take a journey together through the last moments of this great ruler's life, the legacy he left behind, and how the empire was divided. Chaos of us. The death of a leader like Charlemagne was not just the last gasp of a man, but the closing of an era. Through the legacy of loss comes glory. On a cold winter morning in 814, there was a deep silence within the walls of the great palace in Aachen. The great man who had shaped Europe was weakening day by day in the grip of illness. It is said that even on his deathbed, he kept his eye on the maps, still thinking about the future of his lands. It was Charlemagne's greatest desire to protect his people and to secure the legacy of his lineage. But oh, my friends, the emperor's grand dream would not withstand the rivalries between the heirs to his throne. Charlemagne had hoped to divide the empire among his sons, leaving a piece for each of them. Unfortunately, he died on January 28, 814, before he could see how this division would turn into a long-term conflict. Charlemagne's body was buried with great pomp and ceremony in Aachen Cathedral. But beneath the splendor lay great uncertainty for the future of Europe. My dear listeners, the empire that Charlemagne had left behind began to crumble like the branches of a great tree. The struggle for the throne led to an inevitable war between his sons. When Charlemagne's grandsons Lothar, Charles, and Louis signed the Treaty of Verdun to divide the Carolingian Empire, they signed a division that shaped not only the borders but also the future of Europe. Signed in 843, this treaty divided the lands into three. The Kingdom of the West Franks was the foundation of today's France, while the Kingdom of the East Franks laid the roots of modern Germany. The Kingdom of the Middle Franks was short-lived and became a constant battleground. This division reduced the power of the empire and made Europe more vulnerable to the control of feudal lords. My friends, ironically, Charlemagne's great unifying efforts suffered a wound that could not be easily repaired with this fragmentation. Now, despite all these divisions, do you think Charlemagne's legacy has been erased? Oh, absolutely not. Charlemagne's dream was not only to protect the borders of the empire, but also to create a European identity. His educational reforms, his role in the spread of Christianity, his contribution to cultural development, and his reforms of the legal system laid the foundations of modern Europe. Today, it is no exaggeration to say that even the European Union is inspired by Charlemagne. Charlemagne initiated a cultural renaissance. He made schools widely available, pioneered the standardization of Latin, and made it possible to preserve ancient artifacts by supporting writing activities in monasteries. Just think, perhaps many of the ancient texts we read today have come down to us thanks to Charlemagne's vision. My dear friends, in this turbulent period that began with Charlemagne's death, Europe once again came to the brink of the Dark Ages. But with every destruction comes an opportunity. Charlemagne's legacy was not just a political empire. He was the representative of an idea, an ideal. Even today, all over Europe, awards, monuments, and history books bearing Charlemagne's name remind us of his leadership genius. But I cannot help asking you, dear listeners, even though Charlemagne's empire is divided, is his dream of uniting Europe really over? Or will this grand vision continue to resonate centuries later? And how would the vacuum created by this fragmentation shape the future of Europe? For the answers to these questions, let's meet in the next chapter of our story, because history always tells us more, makes us feel more. Charlemagne's empire was not just a collection of kingdoms, but an idea. It was based on the belief that political authority derived from divine power and should be guided by Christianity. Charlemagne saw himself not just as a king, but as God's representative on earth. His coronation by Pope Leo III in 800 was not just a ritual, but a landmark event symbolizing the union of Christianity and worldly power. It laid the ideological foundation for the Holy Roman Empire. Imagine, my dear friends, an order in which a monarch was both a worldly leader and a religious symbol. Charlemagne's descendants and the monarchs that followed continued to shape the political structure of Europe following this model. Charlemagne's determination and vision showed that an emperor would rule not only by the power of his sword, but also by the will of God. But after Charlemagne's death, the empire was divided, the balance of power shaken. But his model echoed across Europe for centuries to come. In 962, when Otto I of the Saxon dynasty was proclaimed emperor by Pope Urban XII, the Holy Roman Empire was officially born. This empire inherited Charlemagne's legacy and continued his dream of a Christian Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was not only a military power, but also a spiritual authority. This close bond between church and state not only helped Europe to gain a unified identity, but also laid the foundation for centuries of conflict. The power struggle between emperors and popes would be both a strong building block and a weak point in this great legacy. My dear friends, the Holy Roman Empire shaped the political and cultural map of Europe throughout the Middle Ages. This process, which began with Charlemagne's vision, defined the borders of Western Europe and laid the foundations of nation-states. Charlemagne's dream was not only to build an empire, but also to create a European civilization. Even today, many political and cultural values in Europe bear echoes of this period. And so, my dear friends, we have come to the end of an era in the depths of history. Charlemagne, that great leader, not only fought battles, but also laid the foundations of his empire and left a legacy that will last for centuries. The order he established was shaped not only by wars and victories, but also by cultural and religious unity. Oh, what dedication, what perseverance he set out with. And in the end, he is remembered as a leader who brought light to the dark Middle Ages. But we must not forget that every victory, every greatness, and every empire has an end. With the death of Charlemagne, this great empire began to fragment and disintegrate. This gigantic structure, built by his mighty hands, began to unravel and reshape when his sons inherited it. Nevertheless, Europe, built on the foundations laid by Charlemagne, carried and shaped this legacy for centuries. With the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, this legacy shaped the political structure of Western Europe, ushering in a new era after the close of one. My dear audience, as history has always shown us, nothing remains constant. The vision of a leader can mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. The chaos of the empires that emerged after the death of Charlemagne teaches us a lesson. Strong hands may leave strong visions, but an empire may not stand the test of time. But with every challenge, after every collapse, comes innovation, change, and transformation. The political map of Europe that continues to take shape is as much a reflection of time and the will of the peoples as it is the legacy of a leader. And now, my dear friends, we have come to an end. But remember, history has no end. We will focus on the aftermath of Charlemagne's death and the complexity of Europe as it continues to take shape. But don't worry, in the next chapter, we will explore the legacy of the Holy Roman Empire and what role it played for the future of Europe. So who was behind this power that changed the political map of Europe and reverberated throughout the Middle Ages? Who will inherit the legacy of this empire and make their mark on the stage of history? Join us in our next episode to find out.